Okay, can everybody see the right slides?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, like Josie said, I'm Kirsten. I'm here at Riley in Indiana at IU, and I've been doing this for about 7 years. And we're going to talk today about some patient-facing things regarding consent. So, I have a quick slide on what we're going to learn today. So some definitions and really some tips and tricks and different types of consent on the front facing side. So first, let's start off with some definitions, just going through some basic relevant terms. So children are considered to be anyone under the age of majority, or as Amy told us in the first presentation, 0 to 18 years in most states. The only two states where the age of majority is 19 are Alabama and Nebraska. Consent is the process of providing information about the study to participants so they can make a voluntary decision to participate. Obviously, as most of us know, children can't legally make these consent decisions for themselves, so they need what we call parental permission to participate. So parental permission is just as it seems. It's the permission of a parent or guardian for a child to participate in research. A parent can be a child's biological or adoptive parent, while the guardian is somebody authorized by law to be able to provide consent for the child. Assent is the child's agreement to be able to participate in research, but not all ages are capable of providing this agreement. Typically, it's about ages 7 to 17 that can provide assent, maybe up to 18, depending on the age of majority in the state. Obviously, like we talked about, Alabama and Nebraska. Assent ages are set by institution. So here at Riley, our assent age begins at 7, so you should check your institutional policy for assent age. So what we typically call consent in our line of pediatric research is actually a mixture between parental permission and assent, if that makes sense. So now that we've kind of gone through some relevant definitions, we're going to go through some things to consider before approaching a subject, parent, family, whatever that situation might look like. First, let's talk about age. So like we saw in the definitions, anyone under 18 needs to have parental permission and assent. Before we approach, we need to determine who has consenting rights for the child, either that parent or guardian. Sometimes, as some of you might have encountered, it's not easy to determine who has those parental rights. To determine who can provide those permissions, provide that parental permission, you should read things like social work notes, ask the clinical team, or even contact social work to see who has those rights. If the patient is a ward of the courts, so they don't have a parent or guardian, the courts are going to be providing consent for clinical consents. But for research, courts generally don't entertain the idea of research because of its voluntary nature. Assent is also required on the, so like I said, assent's required in that parental permission, but sometimes, especially in the PICU and a lot of our research studies, kids can't provide their own assent because they're incapable for various different reasons. I think most classically that kind of looks like intubation and sedation for us, but can also include things like cognitive impairment and even nonverbal kids. So I have a little pop quiz. So in the definitions, we discussed to check your institution's assent policies for age of the child that can provide assent. So if you have a study that is a reliance agreement and the two institutions have different ages on assent, so let's say like ours is 7, like Riley's is 7, I think Nationwide's is like 8 or 9, something like that. Which age is the threshold for consent in that situation? Does anybody know? Anybody?
Wait, are you asking what the age of assent is or the age of consent is?
The age of assent in that situation. Sorry
So
if that
for
was confusing.
no, for Arkansas, it's 7.
Right. So like in a reliance agreement, if you have in a reliance agreement, like the IRB is being regulated by that other institution, right? So they have their own policies on assent. And the institution that you're working at also has the policy on assent. So which age do you take if they're different? I guess is my question.
We always follow, if our age of assent is less than the age of the IRB of record, then we follow ours. However, if the
Yeah.
IRB of record is, so we go with whichever one is more stringent.
Yep. That's the answer. So it's the lowest age. So yes, that was a little confusing. I made it pop quiz like so it would stand out better. So let's talk a little bit about adults with limited capacity. So adults greater than 18 years that can't consent for themselves. So similar situation to what I described with the assent, kids unable to provide assent. So adults that are intubated, sedated, have cognitive impairment or are nonverbal, they actually need an LAR or a legally authorized representative with healthcare power of attorney to be able to consent them. I don't think we run into this too often, but we definitely can. So yeah, just wanted to point that out. So non-English consent, some things to consider before actually getting into a non-English consent. The consent conversation should be conducted in a parent's preferred language. I know that sounds kind of weird, but some families can speak English, but not at a level where the medical terminology can be understood, which should be at an 8th grade level. So we kind of have to determine what that is. And you can determine that by just like your intuition or using teach back questions with the family. And then what forms are needed for non-English consent? So they should be in the parent's language, and short forms can be used if the non-English forms are unavailable depending on the institutional policies. So each institution has different policies on non-English consent. So here at Riley, we can utilize a short form, but when we so we can use a short form, but we immediately have to translate those short forms, or not translate the short forms, sorry, translate those full consent documents and reconsent that subject. So obviously that's not super feasible. So check your institutional policies on non-English consent before you start using short forms. So within the ICFs or informed consent forms, there's a few different forms that go into that. They typically are a like standard consent form, an assent form, and any HIPAA authorization documents that you have. And they can come in different types, which we'll talk about in a minute. Well, different formats, which we'll talk about in a minute, but the different types. Consent can look like a full standard consent document that goes through all of the points that Amy pointed out in the first first presentation, and will include signature lines, but sometimes they can look a little bit different. So an example is in reliance, depending on the approving institution, the main part of the consent is not editable to all sites. So it might split that document in two. So you'll have your main informed consent and then site-specific information. So obviously that can be on a study-by-study basis. So make sure you know what that study's consent forms are like. And a assent form can also come in different varieties. It can be a separate document for all children, or can be two different documents, one for younger children and one for older, if they're not like so younger children as in like toddlers, and then the older teenagers. The older teenagers that can understand things in an eighth grade language, that can actually be in the main consent form as well. So they would sign that same document. So again, I would check each study and see what those assent forms are like. And lastly is the HIPAA authorization. A HIPAA authorization can be included in the main consent form, which I think is fairly standard these days. But some institutions require a separate HIPAA authorization form. So again, I would check per study. So now we're going to talk about some different formats that all of those informed consent forms come in. There are a few different formats, paper, electronic, and verbal that we're going to talk about. Paper consent consists of just how it sounds, printing out all of the documents for physical wet signature. Some tips for that are to use only blue or black ink, use a clipboard so parents have a surface to write on, and this might sound a little weird, but I like to print my documents double-sided or one-sided. And when things are double-sided, I tend to get confused, especially with a clipboard, trying to keep the document like visible to the parents and things. And it's already a tense situation and you might be nervous. So in my experience, printing things out single-sided avoids things being missed in the signature process or even the conversation. So you can avoid minor non-compliance like missing signatures, not writing the year on the date, or very simple things like that can cause you even more work and more paperwork. Next, we're going to talk about electronic consent. Electronic consent can be beneficial and improve accessibility to participation in research to parents or families that can't be at bedside. Typically, it's done through REDCap or DocuSign. And for studies involving the government, the software has to be 21 CFR Part 11 compliant, which we'll talk about after at the end of this slide. Electronic consent has to be clearly stated in the protocol and it has to be approved through the IRB before you can use it. It can be done via iPad or by computer, and again, to increase accessibility to parents that can't be at the bedside, and a link to those electronic forms can be sent to the parents and then later signed by the person obtaining consent. So what is 21 CFR Part 11? It's a guidance that was laid out by the FDA surrounding electronic documentation for research in 1997 to, like I said, increase accessibility. But it can also make things more problematic due to the restrictions that it places on the software. So not all electronic systems are compliant, even REDCap. So like for instance, here at Riley, our REDCap cannot do electronic consent for anything that involves the government, like NIH funding, which is a lot of what we do, and FDA regulated. I'm thinking that it requires a more premium software, which obviously, you know, as we all know, money is tight in a lot of these research studies that are funded by the NIH. So it can also provide a barrier to research teams not be able to use it. So the last format we can use is verbal. It's typically over the phone, again, to increase that accessibility to parents that can't be at bedside. It can be used if the consentee is unable to sign, which is important. But it's not always allowable by each institution. Again, common theme in this presentation is that different institutions have different policies, even especially on verbal consent. I've seen some allow verbal consent with no signature ever by the person that consented. Um, in our case, it would be a parent. And then some that require a signature within a certain amount of time. So again, check your institutional policy before you go doing verbal consent. And then a witness is needed for verbal consent generally. Um, it should be another member of the study team, and they need to listen and confirm that the consent process happened and that the parent actually agreed. So it's kind of a double check. Here's some other materials that you should consider taking with you before the consent. So if the study requires surveys or assessments, go ahead and take those with you. Your documentation of informed consent form, which we'll talk about a little later, but you might want to consider taking it with you for documentation reasons. Any lab documents you need, like orders or grant charge forms. Here at Riley, we still have paper orders for labs. So yeah, make sure you take those with you. Sample kits and ice or a cooler if your samples need them. So before approaching, it's best practice to get approval from the PI and or the clinical team, like the patient's attending physician, to approach and also collect information on the family. So you can talk to the nurse about to gather that information, like things like who's in the room, did the patient's lines draw? If you need an NP swab, like how were others tolerated? How's the family feeling? Are they upset with the clinical team? Are they overwhelmed? Things of that nature. Essentially, you want to gather enough information to be able to identify any challenges and come up with a plan to overcome them if possible. So some other things is that timing is key. And you should pay attention to body language and read the room. So how perceptive, so things like how receptive do you think the family will be right now? Is there something currently happening in the room? Did a procedure just occur? Did the patient just have a significant event? And if things aren't good, ask yourself, can you approach in a little bit? Maybe like if it's the morning, maybe you can go in the afternoon, or even tomorrow, if that's possible. I know a lot of our studies are very time sensitive, so it's not always the case, but if you can give the family time to decompress, it will make them more open to the idea of research, is the idea. So some other people that might need to be part of the consent process are the PI if medical questions need to be answered, if like research medical questions need to be answered, an interpreter if you need to conduct the consent in a different language, and another research staff member, for example, if you're consenting for multiple studies, sometimes having more than one person is beneficial, or if you need a witness, or even if you're training them. And so the last thing that you're going to do before walking into the room is double check eligibility. And again, before you enroll and start study procedures. There's nothing worse than talking to a parent and realizing that you can't enroll that patient. And you have to go back and tell the parent, just kidding, we're actually not going to do the study because they don't qualify anymore. Very awkward conversation. Or even worse, enrolling the subject and realizing that they weren't eligible to begin with. Creates more headache, paperwork, reports, things of that nature. So check eligibility at every step of the way. So now we're going to get, now that we've talked about like the documentation, like the consent, prepping for the consent, we're going to talk about the approach. So before you jump right into research with the parent, the family, the child, whatever it might be, ask if it's a good time. Again, like I said, the more time that you can give the family, probably the better. Um, Offer to get them anything that they need, coffee, tea, a snack, anything that you can provide comfort-wise. Then introduce yourself in the idea of research. Let them know that the institution and the physicians are on board with research and that research is something that commonly happens in your PICU or hospital, CVICU, whatever you manage. And then ask them if they even want to talk about research. I know that that statement is a little controversial, but I like to offer an immediate out just in case I've read the room wrong. There's nothing more awkward than um, realizing, oh, I probably should have not done this. So here's some tips for a successful consent discussion. So provide information how you'd like to receive it. I think that that's pretty obvious, but most importantly, stay within your practice. So don't offer medical explanations if you're unqualified. Don't be afraid to go get a PI, a physician, something. There have been times where I've said, things like your kid has sepsis and the team hasn't necessarily explained to the family that they've explained that there is an infection, but hasn't necessarily used the word sepsis. And I think it's a little out of my practice to be able to explain that. So I've gone and got the team for those situations. Be aware of the temperature of the conversation and the body language that the person has. So, are they giving signs of comfort? Are they listening? Are their eyes glazed over? Do you even think that they're able to comprehend what you're saying? And if you feel uneasy, don't be afraid to end the conversation if it feels wrong. Summarize the informed consent forms, like each paragraph or even each page. Some of the paragraphs can be quite long. Use the consent form as a sort of note card. That's what I like to do. And the paragraph headers are usually things like questions. So answer them for the parent or child in your own words. And be flexible. If something happens to the patient, for example, an alarm goes off, or um, or anything like that, let the parent know that they can interrupt and go to the bedside to be with their child in that time of need. Save signatures to last and complete them all at once. In my experience, saving the signatures until last, again, avoids missing those little places on the consent form and avoids noncompliance. And before jumping right into assent, consult with the parent about how they think is best for you to approach that child. Like, should they introduce you? Are there any tips they can give you to make that conversation easier on the child? Like, for example, if a parent tells you, oh, my child really likes Spider-Man, maybe you can incorporate that in your initial conversation with the child to gain trust and not seem so scary because these kids have a lot of scary things and scary people coming into the room. So in my experience, that is the best way to handle assent, especially on those younger kids. So now we're going to talk about approaching with a principal investigator. Like I said, it might be beneficial to approach with them. Ideally, you're going to go into the room together and have the physician introduce you. And then the physician should go through and explain the more study-specific information, like the purpose, procedures, risks associated with that study, and then answer any medical questions that you might not be qualified to answer, depending. And then you should give the family some time with the consent form. And then the coordinator can go back and explain the more standard study information like a HIPAA authorization or a certificate of confidentiality or protections of PHI like de-identification, all of those happy things. So I'm going to talk about approaching with an interpreter. Yep. So there's a couple different types of acceptable interpreters, in person and phone/virtual. In person, in my opinion, is the easiest to do and most personable. Um, in person also provides someone to physically sign as a witness. Some IRBs need to have a signature, like a wet signature, and some will accept a translator's identification number as their signature. So you should identify which one is acceptable for each study, or if your institution will even allow that at all. Um, and go with that. Before you walk into the room, I think it's important to prep the interpreter with appropriate information. So translators generally don't understand research in my experience. Um, like walk them through the process, maybe some important highlights that you're going to hit, and include that you might need them to sign some paperwork as a witness. Uh, I actually got myself into a sticky situation with an interpreter a few years ago. I didn't think I needed to tell him that he was going to need to sign some paperwork. And so I went in, we got through the whole process, translation wise. We were to the signatures, mom had agreed, and I asked the interpreter to sign as the witness, and he was like, no, I'm not allowed to sign as a witness. And I was like, oh, I think you are. And that uncomfortable situation caused mom to second guess whether she should even be signing these papers. So I always go through with a translator before I walk in that you might need to sign some paperwork and have that discussion away from the family. Um, I think the last important tip is to be succinct. When using when using an interpreter and in a non-English consent. All words that are being spoken are being translated word for word. So it can take double the time that an English consent could take. Um, so some forms wise, you should always start by getting the English consent form. Um, because you'll be able to read that and present that the um, to the family or the parent. And then if you have non-English consent forms, you should also get those so you can provide those to the family so they have a document in their own language. If you don't have those documents, like I went over a little bit earlier, you can use short forms. But what I want to get at here is who signs what. So everyone should only sign the documents that they can read. I know that's going to feel a little bit weird, and it definitely does, having those signatures be disjointed. But the family should be signing the non-English forms, whether that is the full translated consent form or the short form, and that is considered their consent or parental permission or assent. And you should be signing the English forms under the person obtaining consent. So on the Spanish forms, the person obtaining consent lines will be blank, and on the English form, the parental or assent lines will be blank. And then the interpreter will sign both, ideally, because in theory, they should speak both languages. But very important, everyone only signs the documents that they can read. I definitely messed that up very early on in me being a coordinator. So signatures, we just kind of talked about some with that non-English consent, but it's very important to complete all of the sections of the consent forms entirely. Don't miss anything. Make sure to utilize like non-applicable check marks and things of that nature. Obviously, complete all the optional portions. If the subject's name or date of birth is there's a space for that on there. the parent's name, signature, and relationship, dates and times, the person obtaining consent signature, and signature and date and time, and do not write anything in the margins. It's best practice to put those in a note to file or a narrative or something of that nature, instead of making notes on the actual consent form. And lastly, the person obtaining consent and the parent should be signing at relatively the same time. So within a few minutes, those times should match up. I already brought up the documentation of informed consent form, and it should be a sort of standard document. Your institution might have one already made that you can use, or you should make one yourself. It should include things like the study name, IRB number, important names, the date, the time, should be signed by the person obtaining consent, and sometimes a narrative is required. On the left is a picture of what we use here at Riley. We use our institution's template, kind of filled in what we needed, and we keep this with all of our consensus, sort of a cover sheet. So yeah, important thing to have. So now that we've kind of gotten through all of the documentations, I wanted to bring up Alcoa. So if you haven't heard of Alcoa, it's a documentation practice that's used in regulated industries like ours. And it's just a standard way to document. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but if you're unfamiliar with it, I would suggest looking into it. So the last major thing I wanted to hit was when subjects or families need to be reconsented or reassented. So when a minor becomes the age of majority, they're no longer covered under the document or the requirements of kids in research. So they need to be reconsented for themselves. And of course, and this usually only occurs when study procedures are still occurring when they turn the age of majority. Reassent is needed when a child that is incapable becomes capable again. So in our world in the PICU, that could look like a child being extubated and coming off of things like sedatives, but obviously if they're still on protocol. Here's a good resource that I kept going back to when making this presentation. It's a link to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, specifically the Office of Human Research Protections. It's an FAQ on consent. It's a great resource with more specific questions about the consent process, and I would encourage you to read through it and see if there's anything else that you're unaware of. And I think that's all I've got. I've seen some questions in the chat pop up, but do you have any other questions?
Well, there's one from Kristen at St. Jude. She's wondering, in addition to your consent cover sheet, do you also document those same elements in the medical record?
Yes, actually, I think that that's something this presentation is lacking. Here at Riley, we have a standard not clinical note, but a note in the medical record. It's a research note in Cerner that is just standard language that was given out for every study, and it goes through essentially the same thing. So yes.
I think though what you document in the medical record for research is just so dependent on your institution, as Kristen said many times. So as far as what you do Yeah, there's like, there might be a smart note, there might be, um, do you upload a copy of the consent in there or not? That's super variable.
Yep,
And then there are sometimes other back end places that, yeah, so it's just very dependent in my experience.
for sure. Yeah, we utilize things like dot phrase. If you're a Cerner site, you probably know what dot phrase is. Or I don't know, I've never used Epic if that's a thing.
Yeah, we have a
Um,
similar, yeah, similar thing for Epic. Yeah. I had another like tidbit that I thought about as you were talking about like note to files.
mhm.
I think we at Nationwide, we have a couple of like, we have a standard note to file template for a couple scenarios. I can't remember what all of them are, but I know at least one of them is like a lot of times, especially for some of our local studies that say, oh, if we can't get a blood draw from a line, we might poke your child. And how many times do you go in and they're like, well, we really want to be involved as long as you're not going to poke. And so in my early days of research, we would like write in the margin of the consent or something because the parents like wanted it written somewhere that we weren't going to poke their child. So as a way to like document it, but also like not be writing in the margin, like not to be altering the consent, we actually just have a standard template like note to file that has a language about not poking. And if the parents request that, we just print it out and sign it and file that with the consent form. So there, like if there are frequent scenarios that you use, these are like alternative ways to kind of get around the um, like making notes on the consent form.
That's actually really, really smart. I actually just ran into that, and in the heat of the moment, I wrote on the consent form. I will admit it.
Hi,
So,
this is CJ.
hi,
Um,
CJ.
I usually, in that scenario, would put it in the research visit note that the parents requested that their child not be poked. So it is in the
Hmm.
EMR,
Yeah.
and then print it off and put it in the patient binder. Thank you.
That's also a good job, or not a good job, but a good
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah.
I would put it in both, honestly. The parent that I was talking to a few months ago wanted to sign something that said that. So I was like, in the heat of the moment, I was like, okay, I'll just write
Hmm.
it here. But
Hmm.
as I said, don't do that. Do as I say, not as I do.
Well, yeah, there are multiple ways I think to document it, and sometimes finding the most correct way that also satisfies what the parent wants. And so if they want to be able to sign something, then make a little note to file and they could put their signature on it.
Right.
Kristen at St. Jude also asked, how do you remember to return for assent if the patient was incapacitated?
That's a good question. Um, I think that's just something that I lock in the vault, honestly. Because you're kind of following the subject anyway, typically, if the subject's still on protocol, um, if the subject's still on protocol, you're gonna know, you're gonna be involved, you're gonna be around the patient, you're gonna see if they're extubated. So that's a good way. But also probably put that in a checklist. I wonder if like maybe like a final study checklist. I know a lot of people have a
Mhm.
lot of different institutional checklists for different studies, so might be a good place to put it.
Hi, my name's Lindsay. I'm from American Family Children's Hospital. I was just going to add something we like to do is just adding it into our screening log since that's something we look at often. Just adding a note into our screening log that a patient needs to be assented is really helpful as well. Another thing could be like letting nursing know that you need to go back. So if they could like send you a message and keep a note on keep it on their radar when the patient's ready to assent, that's also really helpful.
Definitely a good idea.
something else that we do, we have like, I don't know how much we still use it anymore, but like two methods that we use at Nationwide for just communication amongst our team because it could change from day to day. So it can be hard to know or remember what needs done. We have a whiteboard in our shared office that typically will keep a log of like no PHI, but like we'll write down a study ID, like what study it is, the study ID, and like dates that things need done, is the scent needed, that sort of thing. Or I've even seen like CHOP has like kind of a sophisticated method of like communication amongst their team that they use. I think they use like Teams, and I don't know if they use like OneNote or something. So whatever like method of like team communication slash checklist that you can create, I think is like helpful to just and try to incorporate like with your like when you're collecting samples or surveys or something like that, to add that in as something. But I love the idea too of adding it into your screening log if that's something that you're referencing daily.
Well, awesome. If there's no more questions.
Thanks so much, Kirsten. This was great. I appreciate it.
Thanks. I tried real hard.
Great presentation. Thank you,
Thank
Kristen.
you. Thank you, CJ.
Thanks, Kristen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.